This PowerPoint lecture covers the neuroanatomy of the vertebral column and spinal cord. The spinal cord extends from the foramen magnum to approximately L1, L2 when you're using a bony reference to describe its length. If you want to use a soft tissue reference, we would say that the spinal cord extends from the medulla oblongata to the conus medullaris. The conus medullaris is the cone-shaped end of the spinal cord. From the end of the spinal cord, or conus medullaris, is a collection of nerve roots called the cauda equina. The cord is tethered to the coccyx by a structure called the filum terminale. The filum terminale is a remnant of the caudal part of the spinal cord. It anchors the cord and meninges to the coccyx. It contains nervous tissue and connective tissue. It is covered by pia mater. At the most distal portion of the filum terminale, it gets a new name called the coccygeal ligament. The spinal column protective layers include the vertebral periosteum, the posterior longitudinal ligament, the epidural space that's filled with epidural fat, meninges, and cerebrospinal fluid. The posterior longitudinal ligament covers the posterior aspect of the vertebral bodies and intervertebral disc. It runs from the body of C2 to the posterior surface of the sacrum. It blends with the tectorial membrane superior to the body of the axis, and it functions to stabilize the spine. The epidural space is located between the vertebral periosteum and dura mater. It contains veins and fat. It runs the entire length of the vertebral canal, superiorly from the foramen magnum to inferiorly through the sacral hiatus, and also laterally through the intervertebral foramen. The spinal cord is wrapped in connective tissue called meninges. It has 3 layers going from superficial to deep. You have the dura mater, which is the strongest, toughest layer, and it gets its name because dura means tough, mater means mother, so it's the tough mother. Arachnoid mater is the middle layer, and it gets its name because it will help form a structure called trabeculae that look like little spider webs, and so it got its name arachnoid spider for spider mother. And then pia mater is the innermost layer that's very delicate and tender, and pia means tender, and so it is called the tender mother. The spinal dura mater. It is the toughest, most superficial layer, and it's just deep to the epidural space. It wraps around the nerve roots as they exit the intervertebral foramen, and when it does this, they are called the dural root sheaths. And this dural root sheath will blend with the epineurium of the spinal nerves. The spinal dura mater forms the outer layer of the dural sac. The dural sac encases the spinal cord and runs the length of the vertebral canal. It is anchored superiorly at the foramen magnum and inferiorly at the coccyx by the filum terminale. Spinal arachnoid mater is the middle layer meninge. It lines the dura mater that forms the dural sac. It also forms the lumbar cistern that's caudal to the conus medullaris. And I'll remind you that the conus medullaris is the tapered end of the spinal cord. The lumbar cistern is an enlargement of the subarachnoid space in the dural sac. It contains cerebrospinal fluid, the filum terminale, nerve roots, and the cauda equina. It extends from the conus medullaris to the second sacral vertebra, and it is the location of lumbar punctures, or it's called a spinal tap. The subarachnoid space is formed from arachnoid matter that forms trabeculae that span the subarachnoid space, connecting the arachnoid mater to the pia mater. The subarachnoid space is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. The pia mater is the innermost layer. It's thin, transparent, and very delicate. It covers the spinal cord, nerve roots, and vessels. It forms denticulate ligaments that secure the spinal cord to the dural sac. It also covers the filum terminale. Spinal cord enlargements. The amount of ventral gray horn matter is responsible for the spinal cord enlargements. The spinal cord has two enlargements that give rise to plexuses that innervate the limbs. We have a cervical enlargement that runs from about C4 to T1, and a lumbar enlargement that is found between T11 and S1. The organization of gray matter. The amount of ventral gray matter at a given cord level reflects the amount of motor innervation skeletal muscle receive at that level. So to remind you, in the area of the plexuses, where there's going to be more motor neurons serving the limbs, it's going to have a larger ventral horn, which will be responsible for the cord enlargement. Organization of gray matter continue. In the dorsal horn, you will find interneuron cell bodies and the sensory axons that will be communicating with these interneuron cell bodies. In the ventral horns, you will mostly find somatic motor neuron cell bodies, and their axons will exit the cord via the ventral nerve roots, and they will send signals to skeletal muscle. In the lateral horns, where are only located at the thoracic and superior lumbar cord segments, you will find mostly sympathetic nervous system motor neuron cell bodies, and their axons will exit the cord with somatic motor neurons via ventral nerve roots, and they will send signals to visceral organs, eyes, glands, skin, genitalia, and the bladder, etc. The gray commissure is like an isthmus that connects the horns on each side of the cord. It surrounds the central canal, and within the central canal flows cerebrospinal fluid. Organization of white matter. Most of the cord's white matter is composed of myelinated tracts. In this diagram, you see that it is separated into ascending tracts and descending tracts. The ascending tracts carry sensory or afferent information from the periphery to the brain. The descending tracts carry efferent or motor information from the brain to the periphery. Ascending tracts contain at least 3 neurons: first-order neurons, second-order neurons, and third-order neurons. The first-order neurons carries information from the somatic receptors to the brainstem or spinal cord. Second-order neurons carry information from the brainstem and spinal cord to the thalamus. I want to mention that the thalamus receives all sensory incoming information except from the olfactory nerve. These axons of second-order neurons will cross over either in the spinal cord or in the medulla, so they are said to decussate. Third-order neurons will carry information from the thalamus to the primary somatosensory area that receives all incoming sensory information. The dorsal white column is made up of ascending tracts. It carries sensory impulses from the periphery to the brain. It crosses over in the medulla oblongata, so it is said to desiccate. The source of stimulus carried in these tracts can be precisely located on the body. The dorsal white column is made up of 2 tracts: the fasciculus gracilis, which is able to carry discriminative touch and vibration, and the fasciculus cunatus, which carries joint proprioception. This will be important when you're in clinic, and if a patient can precisely locate the source of their pain or discomfort, then you know that it is being carried in the fasciculus gracilis of the dorsal white column. Spinal cerebellar tracts are also ascending tracts, and they carry sensory proprioceptive fibers from skeletal muscles or tendons to the cerebellum. These signals are subconscious. We don't know that we're receiving them, but they allow the cerebellum to coordinate skeletal muscle movement. These do not cross over, they do not desiccate. or if they do, they cross back, so it undoes the desiccation. So that means proprioceptive sensory information received on one side of the body is going to be received by the same side hemisphere in the brain. Spinothalamic tracts are ascending tracts that mainly transmit impulses for pain and temperature, but they also carry information for coarse touch and excessive pressure. Information carried in these tracts are difficult to locate precisely on the body. So if a patient is saying to you they are experiencing pain across their back or down their leg, but it's very broad, then you'll know it's being carried in the spinothalamic tract. The information carried in these tracts does cross over at the spinal cord, so information received on one side of the body is going to be transmitted to the hemisphere on the opposite side of the body. Descending tracts are made up of two neurons, an upper motor neuron and a lower motor neuron. Upper motor neurons originate in or just under the cortex, and they convey efferent or motor impulses from the brain to the spinal cord. Lower motor neurons that are somatic in origin will be found in the ventral horn of the cord, or autonomic motor neurons will be found in the lateral horn of the cord. These motor neurons will convey efferent or motor information from the cord to skeletal muscle, if it is somatic information, or glands and viscera, if it is autonomic information. Pyramidal or cortical spinal tracts are descending tracts. They desiccate, meaning they do cross over. They have a direct pathway, meaning upper motor neurons will descend without synapsing from the cortex to the level at the cord that they are going to synapse with a lower motor neuron, either in the ventral horn if it's somatic information, or in the lateral horn if it's autonomic information. These neurons, these upper motor neurons in the cortical spinal tracts, convey efferent motor impulses. Extrapyramidal tracts are indirect motor pathways, consisting of a complex multisynaptic system of axons that do desiccate or cross over in the cord. The rubrospinal tracts control flexor muscles. Reticulospinal tracts and vestibulospinal tracts maintain balance by varying tone of postural muscles, and the tectospinal tracts mediate head movements in response to visual stimuli.